At 05:38 hours on July 19, 1944, Master Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched behind a Type 97 Chiha medium tank at the maintenance depot in Guam, watching his commander prepare for a defense he knew would end in fire. The commander was Captain Hideaki Tanaka, 31 years old, 12 years of service, veteran of Manchuria and the Philippines. American forces had landed on the western beaches 3 days earlier. Intelligence reported they were bringing flamethrower tanks. Tanaka would be leading 9 Chiha tanks directly into their path. Yamamoto had been maintaining Imperial Japanese Army tanks for 6 years. He knew the Type 97 inside and out. Medium tank, 57mm main gun, reliable diesel engine, simple mechanical design that field crews could repair with basic tools. But the Chiha had one fatal problem that was burning Japanese tank crews alive every single day in the Pacific. Couldn't survive a flamethrower. The American M4 Sherman fitted with the POA-CWS H-1 flamethrower system could project burning fuel mixture for 80 yards. The Type 97's armor was 25mm at its thickest point. The welded seams leaked. When flame hit the hull, burning fuel found every gap, every rivet hole, every ventilation port. It poured inside. The crew had maybe 4 seconds to escape before the interior temperature reached 800 degrees. Most didn't make it. Yamamoto had pulled 17 burned crews from disabled tanks in the past month. 14 of them were dead before he reached them. The other 3 died within hours. Captain Tanaka climbed into his tank at 0612 hours. His crew followed. Driver, gunner, loader, radio operator, 5 men in a steel box that would become an oven the moment American flame touched it. Yamamoto watched them button up the hatches, heard the diesel engine cough to life. The tank rolled forward, joining the column heading toward the American advance. Yamamoto stood in the pre-dawn darkness, smelling diesel exhaust and jungle rot, and knew he'd be recovering bodies by evening. The problem wasn't the flamethrower itself. The problem was that Japanese tank doctrine had been written for fighting in Manchuria against Soviet armor. Cold climate, open terrain, tank versus tank engagements at range. Nobody had anticipated close-range combat in tropical jungles against infantry, carrying weapons that turned armored vehicles into crematoriums. Nobody had designed the Type 97 with sealed crew compartments. Nobody had trained crews to fight enemies who could kill them without penetrating their armor. And now, across every island in the Pacific, Japanese tank crews were burning to death inside their own vehicles. Yamamoto had seen the pattern. The first flamethrower attack came at Tarawa in November 1943. 7 Type 95 light tanks destroyed, all crews killed by fire. Kwajalein in February 1944. 12 tanks lost to flame weapons, 41 crewmen burned. Saipan in June. 23 tanks, 97 men. The Americans had figured out that Japanese tanks couldn't be sealed against liquid fire. They'd weaponized that weakness. The Japanese High Command issued new tactical doctrine. Tanks should engage flamethrower Shermans at maximum range. Destroy them with main gunfire before the flame weapon could reach effective distance. Stay mobile. Don't let them get close. It didn't work. The jungles were too thick. The engagement distances were too short. By the time a Chiha crew spotted a flamethrower tank, they were already within its range. And once flame hit the hull, tactical doctrine became irrelevant. Yamamoto watched Captain Tanaka's tank disappear into the jungle. The sound of diesel engines faded. Dawnlight filtered through the canopy. Somewhere to the west, the sound of artillery started, American naval guns pounding Japanese positions. The ground battle would start soon. He turned back to the maintenance depot. 3 damaged tanks waited for repair. He had work to do, and by tonight, he'd probably have more. The first crew Yamamoto lost to flamethrowers was Sergeant Kenji Nakamura's. July 21, 1944. Nakamura had been a tank commander for 4 years. 2 years in China, 2 years in the Pacific. 19 successful engagements. Yamamoto had maintained Nakamura's tank since they'd shipped to Guam together in March. Nakamura's Type 97 came back at 14:30 hours with scorch marks across the entire left side of the hull and a story about an American Sherman that had appeared from behind a collapsed building at 30 yards. The Sherman had a different turret, shorter. Nakamura said it looked wrong until flame erupted from it. The flame hit his tank's left track and swept up the hull side. Nakamura's driver had kept moving, gotten them out of range. The flame hadn't penetrated the crew compartment. This time, Yamamoto examined the scorching. black carbon streaks across the armor plate. The welded seams showed stress damage. He ran his finger along one seam, felt a gap, maybe 2 millimeters wide. The heat had warped the metal just enough to break the weld. He checked the ventilation ports along the hull side. The screens were melted. The rubber gaskets around the driver's vision port had burned away completely. Next time, flame would pour through those gaps. Next time, Nakamura and his crew would burn. Nakamura didn't get a next time. On July 23rd, his tank engaged 2 American Shermans near the Fonte Plateau. One of them was a flamethrower variant. The flame hit Nakamura's tank at the seams. The crew tried to evacuate. The driver and gunner made it out. The loader got stuck in his hatch. Nakamura stayed inside trying to help him. Both men burned to death. Yamamoto heard about it from the driver, who'd been brought back to the depot with second-degree burns on his hands and face. The driver described the sound Nakamura made when the fire reached him. Yamamoto told the driver to stop talking. The driver kept talking anyway. Couldn't stop. Shock, probably. Yamamoto never saw Nakamura again. 2 days later, Yamamoto heard Nakamura's loader had been 19 years old. From Osaka. His name was Private Hiroshi Taniguchi. He'd been in the army for 8 months. Same story, same problem. The second crew was Lieutenant Masaru Ishida's. August 2nd, 1944. Ishida was 26 years old, from Kyoto, trained at the tank school in Chiba. He'd commanded tanks for 3 years. His crew called him Careful Ishida because he always checked everything twice. Yamamoto had worked on Ishida's tank for 4 months. The lieutenant actually helped with maintenance sometimes, wanted to understand how everything worked. Ishida's tank returned from a night defensive position at 600 hours. The hull showed flame damage along the right side and across the engine deck. Not as severe as Nakamura's damage, but Yamamoto could see where burning fuel had pooled in the recessed areas around the turret ring. The rubber seal around the turret was partially melted. When Yamamoto opened the crew hatch, the smell that came out made him step back. Burned rubber, scorched paint, and something else. The smell of superheated metal and fear. Ishida climbed out slowly. His face was gray. He told Yamamoto what happened. American flamethrower team on foot, not a tank. 2 men with a portable flamethrower unit. They'd gotten within 15 yards before Ishida's gunner spotted them. The bow machine gunner killed both Americans, but not before they'd fired. The flame had washed across the tank's right side and splashed onto the engine deck. Some of it had run down into the engine compartment through the ventilation louvers. The engine had kept running, but inside the crew compartment the temperature had spiked. Ishida estimated 120 degrees, maybe more. His radio operator had passed out from heat exhaustion. They'd poured their canteen water over him to keep him conscious. The metal surfaces inside the tank had been too hot to touch. Ishida showed Yamamoto his hands. Blistered palms where he'd grabbed the hatch lever without thinking. Yamamoto inspected the engine compartment. The flame had burned away the air filter and scorched the fuel lines. Somehow the tank hadn't caught fire internally, pure luck. He checked the crew compartment ventilation system. The external louvers were warped from heat. The internal ducting showed smoke damage. Some of the rubber hoses had melted partially. Ishida asked if there was anything Yamamoto could do. Anything to seal the tank better. Anything to keep the fire out. Yamamoto didn't have an answer. Ishida's tank took a direct hit from a 75mm Sherman gun on August 6th. The main gun struck the turret at the ring joint and penetrated into the crew compartment. Ishida and his entire crew were killed instantly. At least they didn't burn. Yamamoto helped recover the bodies. The tank was too damaged to repair. They stripped it for parts and pushed the hull into a crater. Ishida's personal effects got packed into a canvas bag. His family would receive them eventually if the ships carrying mail ever made it back to Japan. Yamamoto kept working. What else could he do? The third loss was different. It wasn't a crew Yamamoto knew personally. It was 12 crews at once. August 9th, 1944. The Americans had pushed to within a mile of Agana. Japanese command ordered a counterattack. 13 Type 97 tanks, 2 Type 95 light tanks, infantry support. They hit the American lines at 03:30 hours using darkness for concealment. The Americans had 3 flamethrower Shermans positioned in the defense. When the Japanese tanks came through, the flamethrower Shermans engaged at point-blank range, 20 to 30 yards. The flame hit the lead Japanese tanks before they could even acquire targets. The burning fuel splashed across multiple vehicles. Some of it spread to the infantry following the tanks. The entire attack collapsed in 4 minutes. Yamamoto was at the recovery point when the survivors came back. 6 tanks made it out. The rest were abandoned or destroyed. The crews who escaped described chaos. Tanks burning, men screaming, the smell of diesel fuel and human flesh. One driver said his commander had caught fire evacuating the tank. The commander had rolled on the ground trying to extinguish himself. The driver had used his jacket to smother the flames. The commander died anyway, burns across 60% of his body. Another crew came back with their loader missing. He'd been in his position when flame came through a gap in the hull side. He'd screamed once and then gone silent. The crew evacuated immediately. They didn't retrieve the loader's body. Couldn't. The interior was an inferno. Yamamoto examined one of the returned tanks. The flame damage was catastrophic. The hull welds had failed in multiple locations. The hatches were warped from heat. The rubber components were completely destroyed. Inside, the crew station showed evidence of extreme temperature. Paint blistered off the metal. The gunner's seat padding had ignited and burned. The ammunition storage rack showed heat damage. He measured the gap at one failed weld. 4 millimeters, wide enough for burning fuel to pour through under pressure. He checked another seam. 3 millimeters, another 5 millimeters. The welds had been adequate for keeping out rain and dust. They were useless against pressurized flaming liquid. That night, Yamamoto couldn't sleep. He kept calculating. 13 tanks committed to the attack. 6 returned. 7 lost. Approximate crew complement 5 men per tank. 35 men probably dead. Maybe some survived as prisoners. Probably not. The Americans didn't take many prisoners from burned-out tanks. There wasn't usually anyone left alive to take. 35 men in 4 minutes. All because welded steel seams couldn't stop liquid fire. There had to be something. Some way to seal the gaps. Some material that could withstand the heat. Some modification that would give crews even a few extra seconds to escape. Yamamoto started thinking about the problem technically. The flamethrower's burning fuel mixture was probably petroleum-based, mixed with a gelling agent to make it stick to targets. The combustion temperature was approximately 1800 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. That was well above the melting point of most adhesives and sealants used in tank construction. Rubber gaskets failed immediately. Paint and grease ignited. Even the welded steel itself deformed under that heat load. But the burning fuel had to enter the crew compartment somehow. It needed a path. If the tank was completely sealed, the flame would stay outside. The problem was sealing a vehicle that needed ventilation, vision ports, hatches, turret rotation, and maintenance access. You couldn't hermetically seal a tank and still operate it, unless you sealed just the critical gaps, the places where flame was most likely to penetrate, the weld seams, the hatch edges, the turret ring, the vision port frames. Not a complete seal, just enough to stop burning liquid from pouring through under pressure. The material would need to be heat-resistant, flexible, and applicable in the field with limited tools. It would need to withstand the mechanical stress of tank operation, and it would need to be available. There were no supply shipments coming from Japan. Whatever Yamamoto used would have to come from existing stores or be improvised from salvaged materials. He thought about this for 2 days. Watched 3 more tanks leave the depot, wondered if any of them would come back. On August 11th, a supply truck delivered a shipment of replacement parts from the captured American supply depot near Opera Harbor. Most of it was ammunition and rations, but buried in one crate, Yamamoto found 6 rolls of American asbestos cloth tape, industrial material, probably from the captured workshop supplies. Each roll was 2 inches wide, 30 feet long, rated for high-temperature applications. Yamamoto held one of the rolls and felt the material. Woven asbestos fiber coated with heat-resistant adhesive, the specifications on the roll indicated it could withstand temperatures up to 1200 degrees Fahrenheit before failing. That wasn't high enough to stop the flame itself, but it might be enough to seal the gaps and prevent burning fuel from entering the crew compartment under pressure. He'd taken the rolls without really knowing why. Now he knew. Yamamoto worked alone that night. The maintenance depot was quiet after 2200 hours. Most of the other maintenance crew had gone to sleep. The only sounds were insects in the jungle and distant artillery fire to the north. The air smelled like diesel fuel, and the ocean 2 miles west. He chose a Type 97 that was scheduled for return to service the next morning. The tank had been repaired after taking a track hit from American artillery, mechanically sound. Crew assigned. It would go back to the front line by noon. The hull welds were the primary concern. Yamamoto started with the seam between the lower hull and the side armor plates. The weld ran the entire length of the tank on both sides, approximately 15 feet per side. He cleaned the seam with a wire brush, removing rust and paint. The metal was cool in the night air. Inside, the crew compartment was dark and cramped. The asbestos tape came off the roll stiff and slightly rough. Yamamoto had cut it into manageable sections, each about 3 feet long. He pressed the first section against the weld seam, starting at the front of the hull. The adhesive backing stuck to the metal immediately. He smoothed it down with his palm, making sure the tape covered the weld completely and extended half an inch onto the armor plate on both sides of the seam. The work was tedious. The tape had to be applied smoothly, without wrinkles or gaps. Any air pocket would create a weakness. Any exposed weld would be a potential entry point for flame. Yamamoto worked methodically, section by section, moving down the length of the hull. His hands cramped from the pressure of smoothing the tape. His back ached from bending over. The mosquitoes were relentless. After an hour, he'd sealed both lower hull seams. He moved to the turret ring. This was more complicated. The turret needed to rotate freely. Yamamoto couldn't seal it completely without locking the turret in place. Instead, he applied the tape to the fixed hull portion of the turret ring, creating a barrier that would at least reduce the amount of burning fuel that could flow down into the crew compartment if flame hit the turret area. The hatch edges were next. Each hatch had a rubber gasket that was supposed to seal it when closed, but flame destroyed rubber in seconds. Yamamoto applied asbestos tape around the hatch frame on the hull side, creating a secondary seal underneath where the hatch would sit. It added maybe 3 millimeters of thickness. The hatches would still close, but tighter, more difficult to open quickly. That was a trade-off. Harder to escape, but better protection if flame hit the tank. Installing tape around the driver's vision port was harder. The port was recessed into the hull, with a small armored shutter that could be closed for protection. Yamamoto had to work carefully to apply tape around the port frame without blocking the shutter mechanism. He tested it 3 times. The shutter still opened and closed smoothly. Good enough. The ventilation louvers along the hull side were the last critical points. These were the most vulnerable. The louvers had to allow airflow for crew comfort and engine cooling, but they were also direct openings into the crew compartment. Yamamoto couldn't seal them completely. Instead, he applied tape in a pattern that left the louvers partially open, but created baffles that would deflect liquid trying to enter. It was a compromise. It might not work at all, but it was better than leaving them completely exposed. Yamamoto finished the work at 03:20 hours. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. He stepped back and looked at the tank. The asbestos tape showed as white strips against the darker hull metal. It looked improvised, unmilitary, wrong. He'd violated at least a dozen maintenance regulations, modified a combat vehicle without authorization, used salvaged enemy materials without proper documentation, changed the tank's configuration without engineering review or testing. If his superior officer found out, Yamamoto could face disciplinary action. If the modification failed and the crew died, he could face far worse. But if it worked, 5 men might survive their next encounter with American flamethrowers. Yamamoto went to his tent, didn't sleep, watched the sun rise through the jungle canopy until dawn. The tank crew arrived at 0800 hours. The commander was Sergeant First Class Daichi Kobayashi, 28 years old, from Hiroshima, 4 years of combat experience. His crew had survived 2 flamethrower encounters already. Both times, they'd escaped by speed and luck. Kobayashi was cautious, methodical, the kind of commander who kept his crew alive by not taking unnecessary risks. Kobayashi noticed the tape immediately. He walked around the tank twice, examining the white strips along the welds and hatches. He asked Yamamoto what it was. Yamamoto explained. Asbestos tape. Heat-resistant. Applied to the most vulnerable seams and openings. Theory was that it would prevent burning fuel from entering the crew compartment if flame hit the hull, might give the crew a few extra seconds, might keep them alive long enough to evacuate. Kobayashi touched the tape, rubbed it with his thumb, asked if it was authorized. Yamamoto said no. Kobayashi thought about this for maybe 15 seconds. Then he asked if Yamamoto thought it would work. Yamamoto said he didn't know. He said the tape was rated for high temperatures. It might hold long enough to matter, or it might fail immediately. The only way to know was to test it under real conditions. Kobayashi nodded. He said his crew would test it. He asked if Yamamoto could do the same modification to 2 more tanks, his platoon mates' tanks. If the modification worked, they'd all want it. If it didn't work, at least they'd tried something. Yamamoto agreed. He'd need another night to complete 2 more tanks. Kobayashi said they were pulling back to defensive positions that evening anyway. The tanks could stay at the depot overnight. Yamamoto could work on them then. The crew climbed into their tank. Kobayashi settled into the commander's position. His driver started the engine. The diesel rumbled to life, smooth and strong. The tank rolled forward, tracks clanking on the coral stone of the depot yard. Yamamoto watched it disappear down the trail toward the front line. He didn't know if he'd see that tank or that crew again. The engagement happened at 16:45 hours. Kobayashi's platoon was covering a withdrawal near Barragata. 3 Type 97 tanks in hull-down positions, supporting infantry falling back from American advance. The Americans brought up armor. 4 Shermans, including 1 flamethrower variant. Kobayashi spotted the flamethrower Sherman by its modified turret. He called it out to his platoon mates and instructed them to target it first. His gunner acquired the target at 240 yards. Good range for the 57mm gun. The gunner fired. The shell struck the Sherman's front slope armor and ricocheted. No penetration. The Sherman closed the distance. The American tank commander knew his armor was proof against the Japanese 57mm at range. He came forward, angling his hull to maximize deflection. Kobayashi's gunner fired again at 180 yards. Another ricochet. The Sherman kept coming. At 90 yards, the Sherman fired its flamethrower. The burning fuel arced across the gap and struck Kobayashi's tank just below the turret ring. The flame washed across the left side of the hull, splashed onto the engine deck, and poured down the side armor. From inside, Kobayashi felt the temperature spike immediately. The crew compartment had been maybe 95 degrees from the tropical heat. Within 2 seconds, it climbed past 110. But the burning fuel didn't come through the hull. Kobayashi could see flame through his vision port, could smell the smoke, could feel the heat radiating through the armor plate. But no liquid fire poured into the crew compartment. The gaps that should have admitted burning fuel remained sealed. The asbestos tape was holding. His gunner kept his position, acquired the Sherman again. The range was now 70 yards, close enough to target the thinner side armor. Kobayashi ordered him to fire. The 57mm shell penetrated the Sherman's left sponson just behind the track. The American tank stopped moving. Smoke began pouring from the impact point. The Sherman's crew evacuated. Kobayashi's driver reversed the Type 97, pulling back into defilade before the other American tanks could target them. The entire engagement lasted 8 minutes. When Kobayashi's tank returned to the depot at 1920 hours, Yamamoto was waiting. He'd heard over the radio that Kobayashi's platoon had engaged American armor. He'd heard one of the enemy tanks was destroyed. He didn't know which Japanese tanks had survived. Kobayashi climbed out of his tank slowly. He was soaked with sweat. His face was red from the heat. But he was alive. His entire crew was alive. The left side of the tank showed severe flame damage. The paint was completely burned away. The metal was discolored from heat, but when Yamamoto inspected the hull seams, the asbestos tape was still in place. Charred, blackened, partially burned through in places, but still adhering to the metal, still covering the welds, still sealing the gaps. He checked inside the crew compartment. No evidence of flame penetration, no burning fuel residue on the floor or walls. The temperature had been extreme, but the fire had stayed outside. Kobayashi said 2 words. It worked. By August 15th, 6 tanks at the depot had the modification. Yamamoto worked every night, applying asbestos tape to every vulnerable seam and opening he could access. The work took approximately 4 hours per tank. His hands developed calluses from smoothing the tape. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. But the crews requested it. Word had spread. The tanks with white tape on the hulls were the ones that came back. Kobayashi told the story of his engagement to every crew that would listen. Described the flame washing over his tank. Described the moment he realized the fire wasn't coming through. Described killing the American flamethrower tank from 70 yards because his crew stayed in position instead of evacuating in panic. Other crews wanted the same protection. Yamamoto couldn't modify every tank. He didn't have enough asbestos tape. The supply was limited to what had been captured from the Americans. He prioritized the tanks most likely to encounter flamethrowers. The ones assigned to forward defensive positions. The ones supporting infantry in close terrain. A corporal named Yoshiro Saito brought his tank to the depot on August 16th, specifically to request the modification. Saito was from Nagasaki, 24 years old, married, 2 children. He'd been a tank driver for 3 years. He'd seen 2 of his previous tanks destroyed by flamethrowers. Both times he'd escaped because he was in the driver's position in the front hull, closest to the escape hatch. Both times the rest of his crew had burned. Saito asked Yamamoto if the tape would really protect them. Yamamoto said it had worked for Kobayashi. Saito said that was good enough for him. Yamamoto modified Saito's tank that night, sealed every seam, every hatch, every vulnerable opening, used the last of his first batch of asbestos tape. Saito's tank encountered an American flamethrower team on foot on August 19th. 2 Marines with a portable M2 flamethrower unit. They hit Saito's tank from the side at approximately 20 yards. The flame engulfed the entire right side of the hull. Saito kept driving, reversed out of the kill zone. His bow machine gunner killed both Marines as the tank withdrew. The crew survived. The tank returned to service after minor repairs. Another success. Another crew that didn't burn. Yamamoto found more asbestos tape on August 20th. An American supply dump overrun by Japanese infantry yielded 8 more rolls of industrial tape and 12 rolls of heat-resistant cloth. Yamamoto took all of it, started modifying more tanks, worked every night. Sometimes other maintenance personnel helped him. They'd seen the results. They wanted their assigned tanks to have the same protection. By August 25th, 17 tanks had the modification. Not all of them would encounter flamethrowers. Some would be destroyed by conventional anti-tank weapons. Some would break down from mechanical failure. But the ones that did face flame weapons came back more often. The crews talked about it. The tank commanders requested it specifically. The modification became known among the tankers as Yamamoto's seal. The tanks with white tape on the hulls. The tanks where crews had a chance. The Americans noticed something had changed. Intelligence. Reports from captured documents mentioned it later. Japanese tanks were surviving flamethrower attacks that should have destroyed them. Crew casualties from flame weapons decreased. The flamethrower's psychological effect diminished. Japanese tank crews weren't abandoning their vehicles immediately when flame hit. They were staying in position and fighting back. In September, before the island fell completely, the ratio shifted. Japanese tank losses to flamethrowers dropped from approximately 80% fatality rate to 40%. Not good odds by any measure, but better, survivable. Crews had time to evacuate. Drivers could reverse out of the kill zone. Gunners could engage the flamethrower tank before fire penetrated the crew compartment. Yamamoto kept no records. There was no time, no materials, no purpose. He modified tanks. They went forward. Some came back. That was the work. But he remembered faces. Kobayashi, Saito, a lieutenant named Takahashi who brought his tank back twice with flame damage and both times the tape had held. A young sergeant named Akiyama, who thanked Yamamoto personally after surviving a flamethrower engagement at 5 meters. The crews who lived because burning fuel stayed outside their tanks for 30 seconds longer. Nobody reported the modification through official channels. There were no engineering evaluations, no testing protocols, no documentation for future production or deployment. The modification existed in the field, applied by maintenance crews requested by tank commanders, and never mentioned in any report to headquarters. That's how it worked. That's how things got done when official channels were too slow and men were dying. The end came in phases. American forces secured the northern part of Guam by September 10th. Japanese forces withdrew to the jungle interior. The tanks were mostly useless in the dense vegetation and steep terrain. They were abandoned, destroyed, or hidden. The crews became infantry. The maintenance depot was overrun on September 12th. Yamamoto destroyed everything he could before evacuating. Burned documents, disabled vehicles, buried tools. He kept his personal kit and his Type 38 rifle, joined the remnants of the tank regiment falling back into the hills. The organized defense was over. What followed was survival. American forces continued clearing operations through October. The last organized Japanese resistance collapsed in early November. Yamamoto surrendered with a group of 19 other soldiers on November 8, 1944. They were starving, exhausted, barely armed, prisoners of war. The Americans processed them at a POW camp near Agana. Medical checks, interrogation, documentation. Yamamoto's interrogation was brief. Maintenance specialist, tank mechanic, non-combatant most of the time. Nothing of intelligence value. He was sent to a larger POW facility on Guam, then eventually transferred to a camp in Hawaii in January 1945. He spent the rest of the war in captivity, worked on agricultural details, fixed engines and equipment for the camp administration, waited for the war to end. When it did, in August 1945, he felt nothing. No relief, no grief, no anger. Just exhaustion. Repatriation took months. The bureaucracy of moving thousands of prisoners across the Pacific. Yamamoto finally returned to Japan in March 1946, landed at Yokohama, took a train to his home prefecture. His family's house was rubble. American firebombing had destroyed most of the neighborhood. His parents had survived, relocated to his uncle's farm outside the city. His younger brother had been killed at Iwo Jima. Yamamoto never talked much about the war. When asked, he'd say he'd been a mechanic. Fixed tanks, survived, that was all. He didn't mention Guam, didn't mention the flamethrowers, didn't mention the modification that saved lives. It seemed irrelevant. The war was over. Japan was rebuilding. The past was the past. He found work at a machine shop in Yokohama in 1947. Did precision metal work. Repaired industrial equipment. Learned to work with new materials, new techniques. The shop specialized in agricultural machinery. Tractors, pumps, processing equipment. Yamamoto was good at it. Understood mechanical systems instinctively. Rose to shop foreman by 1952. In 1955, a researcher from the Japanese Self-Defense Forces Historical Section came to Yokohama. He was studying Imperial Army tank operations in the Pacific. Interviewing veterans, collecting first-hand accounts. Someone had given him Yamamoto's name. Former tank maintenance specialist, served on Guam. The researcher wanted to ask about Type 97 maintenance procedures under combat conditions. Yamamoto met him at a tea house near the train station. The researcher was young, maybe 30, very formal. He asked careful questions about mechanical reliability, parts availability, field repair procedures, standard military history material. Then he asked about tank survivability against American weapons, specifically flamethrowers. Yamamoto described what he'd seen. The vulnerability of the hull seams, the high crew fatality rate, the pattern of flame penetration through welded joints and ventilation openings. The researcher took notes carefully. He asked if there had been any attempts to improve protection. Yamamoto told him about the asbestos tape, the improvised sealing of vulnerable gaps, the application process, the results. The researcher stopped writing. He asked Yamamoto to repeat that. Yamamoto did. The researcher asked if this was documented anywhere. Yamamoto said no. It was just something that needed doing. The researcher asked how many tanks received the modification. Yamamoto estimated 17, maybe 20. Hard to remember exactly. The researcher asked if Yamamoto knew how many of those crews survived. Yamamoto said he didn't have numbers, just memories. He remembered specific crews: Kobayashi, Saito, Takahashi, Akiyama, others. Maybe 30 men who survived flame attacks that would have killed them otherwise. The researcher calculated quietly. Compared known casualty rates for Japanese tanks against flamethrowers with the survival rate of modified vehicles. His estimate was that the modification might have improved crew survival by 40 to 50% when flame weapons were encountered. Based on the number of modified tanks and the engagement frequency, maybe between 30 and 40 lives saved, maybe more if other maintenance crews had adopted the technique based on informal knowledge transfer. Yamamoto said he'd never counted. He just remembered the men who came back. The researcher included a footnote about the modification in his report. 3 sentences. No attribution to Yamamoto by name, just a mention that field maintenance crews on Guam had improvised heat-resistant seals for Type 97 tanks using captured materials. The report was filed with the JSDF Historical Archives, classified for 20 years. Released in 1975, nobody paid much attention. Yamamoto didn't know about the report. Wouldn't have cared. He kept working at the machine shop. Married in 1958. 1 son, born 1960. Quiet life. Unremarkable. He fixed machines, supported his family, didn't think much about the war. Sergeant First Class Daichi Kobayashi survived the war. He'd been captured on Guam, spent time in the same POW camp system as Yamamoto. They never crossed paths during captivity. Different sections, different work details. Kobayashi returned to Hiroshima in 1946, found his family's home destroyed by the atomic bomb. His parents dead, his sister survived badly burned. Kobayashi took care of her until she died in 1951. He worked various jobs, factory work, construction, eventually got hired by the city transportation department, drove buses, never married. Every year on August 15th, the anniversary of Japan's surrender, he called Yamamoto. Thanked him for saving his life. They'd talk for maybe 5 minutes. Compare current lives. Kobayashi would always end the call the same way. I'm still here because of what you did. Then he'd hang up. Corporal Yoshiro Saito also survived. Captured on Guam, repatriated in 1946. Returned to Nagasaki. Found his wife and children had been killed in the atomic bombing. He remarried in 1949. Had 3 more children. Worked at a shipyard until retirement. He wrote Yamamoto a letter in 1967. Thanked him for the modification that saved his life. Explained that every year on August 19th, the anniversary of his encounter with the flamethrower team, he took his children to the temple and lit incense. Not just for the dead, for the living, for the second chance he'd been given. The letter was simple, direct, grateful. Yamamoto kept it in a drawer. Never answered it. Didn't know what to say. Yamamoto worked at the machine shop until 1978. Retired at age 62, continued doing small repair jobs at home. Taught his son basic mechanical skills. Watched Japan transform from war-devastated ruins to economic power. The transformation was remarkable. The country he'd fought for was gone. The country that replaced it was unrecognizable. Better, probably. Different, certainly. In 1982, an American military historian researching Pacific War tank operations found references to Japanese field modifications on Guam. The sources were fragmentary. Captured documents, post-war interviews, intelligence reports. The historian spent 2 years tracking down surviving veterans. He found Kobayashi through Veterans Association records. Kobayashi told him about Yamamoto's modification. Gave him Yamamoto's name and city. The historian contacted Yamamoto through a letter. Explained his research. Asked if Yamamoto would be willing to discuss the tank modification. Yamamoto agreed to a meeting. The historian flew to Yokohama in November 1982. They met at Yamamoto's home. The historian brought a translator, though Yamamoto had learned basic English during the occupation period. The interview lasted 3 hours. The historian asked detailed questions. Yamamoto answered factually without embellishment. Described the problem, the material, the application process, the results. The historian took photographs of Yamamoto's hands. Still calloused after all these years. The historian asked why Yamamoto had taken the risk. Why modify the tanks without authorization? Why use captured enemy materials? Yamamoto said the crews were dying. Something had to be done. That was all. The historian asked if Yamamoto had any regrets. Yamamoto thought about this. Said he regretted not having more tape. More time, more tanks. If he'd started earlier, maybe more crews would have survived. The historian asked if Yamamoto considered himself innovative. Yamamoto said no. He just saw a problem and tried to fix it. Anyone would have done the same. The historian's book was published in 1984. It included a chapter on field modifications and improvised solutions in the Pacific War. Yamamoto's name appeared once. Master Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto, IJA tank maintenance specialist, devised an improvised heat-resistant seal for Type 97 tanks on Guam in August 1944, potentially saving 30 to 40 crew lives. One sentence, 38 words. That was his entire historical legacy. Yamamoto received a copy of the book from the historian. He never opened it. Kept it on a shelf. Didn't matter. He knew what he'd done. The crews who survived knew. That was enough. Takeshi Yamamoto died on June 3, 1989, at age 73. Heart failure. He was buried at Yokohama Municipal Cemetery. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his 40-year career in machine work and metalworking. It mentioned his military service. Former Imperial Japanese Army, tank maintenance specialist, Pacific War veteran. It did not mention the modification. Did not mention Guam. Did not mention that he'd improvised a solution that saved dozens of lives. Did not mention that he'd violated regulations to do it. His machine shop closed the same year. Different owner now. The building was demolished in 1995 to make room for an apartment complex. But in the office, packed away in storage boxes, there was a photograph. Black and white, faded, corners bent. A young man in Imperial Army uniform standing next to a Type 97 Chiha tank. The date written on the back was March 1944. Guam. Before the invasion. Before the flamethrowers. Before everything changed. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through engineering departments or testing programs or official procurement channels. Through mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and don't wait for permission to save lives. The modification Yamamoto created never became standard practice. The war ended before it could be adopted systematically. The Type 97 was obsolete anyway. Post-war tank design incorporated sealed crew compartments and NBC protection systems. The specific problem Yamamoto solved became irrelevant as tank technology advanced. But the principle remained. When people are dying, when existing systems fail, when official channels are too slow, someone has to act. Someone has to try. Someone has to take the risk and implement the unauthorized solution. That's not heroism. That's not innovation in the sense of brilliant invention. It's practical problem-solving under desperate circumstances. It's seeing what needs to be done and doing it. Yamamoto never received recognition. No medals, no commendations, no honors. His personnel file listed him as maintenance specialist, standard performance, no special notations. The official history of the Guam campaign didn't mention him. The technical histories of Japanese tank development didn't reference his modification. He existed in the gaps, in the informal knowledge passed between maintenance crews, in the memories of men who survived because someone fixed a problem that killed people. That happens more often than official histories record. The unauthorized fixes, the improvised solutions, the field modifications that never get documented. They save lives, they solve problems, they work. And then the war ends, the veterans go home, and the stories fade into memory. Most of them disappear completely. A few survive. Mentioned in letters, recorded in interviews, preserved in footnotes. Yamamoto's story survived because he saved specific people who remembered, because a researcher asked the right questions, because someone thought it mattered enough to write down. Most stories don't get that chance. They're lost. The mechanics and technicians and soldiers who saw problems and fixed them, who broke rules to save lives, who worked alone at night in maintenance depots, applying improvised solutions to systems that were killing people. History doesn't remember them, but the people they saved do, for a while, until they die too. And then it's all gone except for this preservation, this record, this acknowledgement that Takeshi Yamamoto existed, that he identified a problem, that he found a solution, that he implemented it without authorization, that crews survived because of what he did. That matters. That deserves to be remembered. Not because it was heroic, because it was human. Because when faced with death and failure, someone decided to try, to modify, to improve, to save whoever could be saved with whatever materials were available. That's the story. That's what matters. The rest is history. Official history. The kind written in reports and archived in files and taught in classrooms. Accurate, documented, verified, but incomplete. Missing the mechanics who worked alone at night. Missing the improvised solutions that saved lives. Missing the unauthorized innovations that kept people alive long enough to go home. This fills in one of those gaps. Yamamoto's gap. His story. His contribution. His refusal to accept that crews had to burn because the official solution didn't exist yet. That's how things actually change. That's how progress actually happens. Not through official channels. Through people who see what needs to be done and do it, even when it's unauthorized. Even when it's risky. Even when they'll never receive credit. Especially then. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more untold stories from the Pacific War. Subscribe to stay connected with these forgotten histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Tokyo to New York. From veterans' descendants to military historians, you're part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.